So I flew all the way from Australia to Houston, Texas to test out the ARRI Alexa Mini LF against the brand new LUMIX S1II. So no, actually not really, but LUMIX Australia did actually send me over to Texas to test out this camera, but I got to meet all the North Americans. But this in no way is going to sway my decision on what I'm going to be saying about this camera, but I mean, you've got to take that as you will. So let's get into the rest of the video. And this video is just going to be a bit more of a hands-on what I thought of the S1II, because I've only had a few weeks with it, but it is very similar to the S1R2. So in terms of the body, the size, it's just the sensor that's the biggest difference, and the image quality that we got to be talking about. But I will be comparing the LUMIX S1II to a couple of other different cameras, so be sure to subscribe and check those videos out. And just for a little bit of context when it comes to the price, the S1II comes in at about 5,299 Australian dollars at release and 3,199 US dollars at the release. Now this is a little bit over the price of the Nikon Z6 III, but it's under the price of the Sony FX3. So take that information into consideration before the rest of the video. Now at the same time as this S1II body, they did release the S1II as well, which seems to be more of a budget version of this, but does that cut directly into the S5II and the S5II XLs? Well, I actually think so, because that camera is pretty incredible. It's got the exact same sensor, just different resolutions, a couple of different features, because this is more of the high-end version of that camera, but it's pretty incredible. They've got two different versions of this. It's the exact same body, like I said, same sensor, just a cheaper version with some cheaper features. But will that get me to sell my S5IIX? I mean, maybe. I could potentially be picking one of those up and selling off my S5IIX. It really just depends. I'll have to compare them side by side to see if that's what I'm going to do with my kit. So at this point in time, the S1II doesn't have ARRI-LOG-C, but it will be coming in a future firmware update. So this is going to give you that ARRI, obviously color tones. So we're testing it with just regular V-Log right now, and then eventually that ARRI-LOG-C will be coming. It would be nice to have it now, but we don't have it now. But it should be perfectly fine just to see what the 6K is against the 4K in the ARRI. So I do have to preface right from the start that the ARRI Alexa Mini LF is in a league of its own. It shouldn't really be compared to the LUMIX S1II, but I did want to just see, what the dynamic range is going to be like, what the skin tone is going to be like, and you could potentially use this as a B cam to a professional cinema camera. Now, the ARRI Alexa Mini LF literally makes movies from Hollywood. It's pretty incredible. It is an absolute beast, but in saying that, the image quality out of this thing is just absolutely phenomenal, and sometimes it can even be hard to see the difference between the two footage. And realistically, it comes down to just the workflow on the production sets, but also the most amount of flexibility in post-production that you do get with ARRI cinema cameras. But I'm actually just amazed that a camera that is, 10 times less the price of an ARRI Alexa still looks incredibly good. And massively comes down to how you light the scene, the story, acting, directing. There's so many different fundamentals when it comes to filmmaking, rather than just comparing straight image quality. But hey, the LUMIX S1II still holds up pretty well. And absolute massive shout out to Orlando as well for hooking this up. He is an absolute legend. But hey, before I get absolutely annihilated in the comments, comparing this to the ARRI Alexa is completely unjust. Like, this camera is just not on the same level as an ARRI Alexa, but it's just really interesting to see what kind of image quality you're actually getting out of these small mirrorless cameras. It's just insane. But this camera would actually suit comparing it against the Sony FX3, because they're on very similar class in terms of specs, the price. Maybe that's a future video, so make sure you subscribe. But let's move on to what kind of resolutions we can get out of this camera. So when it comes to the resolutions and frame rates out of this thing, it's pretty overwhelming, because there's so many different frame rates, resolutions, codecs that you can actually choose in this camera. But you have pretty much 6K open gate, which is 3:2, but you can also do the new 2.4:1 ratio, which gives you 60 frames per second at 6K as well. But then you also have 5.9K with 16:9 format at 60 frames per second. But obviously the most impressive is Cinema 4K, which is 17:9 at 120 frames per second. But the caveat with that is that you lose object tracking. And if you want object tracking, you got to go down to 96 frames per second, which is absolutely wild. And we will talk about the autofocus performance, because I am absolutely impressed. And obviously, because it does internal ProRes RAW recording into the CF Express Type B, you can do 5.8K, which is a pixel by pixel, but it's 4.2 gigabits per second. But you can see Once again, there's a whole bunch of different flavors and frame rates when it comes to ProRes RAW HQ, ProRes RAW, ProRes 422 HQ, and ProRes 422. And look, you can see there is absolutely insane amounts of frame rates and resolutions and crops in this camera. Definitely rewind that because there's so many that we would have to talk about. It would probably take like 2 hours to go through absolutely everything. So I'm not going to do that, just to save you guys a little bit of effort and a little bit of time. So rewind, have a look, screenshot, do whatever you need to do. But this thing is just absolutely stacked when it comes to frame rates, codecs, crops, it's just crazy. But let's move on. Now, if you did see my S1R2 video, it's pretty much identical to that camera when it comes to the whole body and design. The only differences that you will actually see in this camera to the S1R2 essentially is just that sensor. But in saying that as well, there are a couple of other different features that we will be getting in this that you don't get in the S1R2, but I will compare those two cameras in a future video. So when it comes to this sensor, it is a 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor. Now, we potentially do see this exact same sensor in the Nikon Z6 Mark III. Whether it's the same, not 100% sure, but what this does give us is the ISO at the base level at 640, and the second base is ISO 5000, which is a little bit different to the Nikon Z6 III, but you also do have that dynamic range expansion boost mode, only allows you one base of 1000. Now, we do have to dive deeper into that dynamic range boost because the rolling shutter is incredibly unusable. It's not really that great, but could be really good for talking head pieces because it gives you one stop of dynamic range extra on top of your standard native ISO levels. But in my opinion, ISO 640 is obviously extremely useful, and so is that ISO 5000. It's just high enough where you're getting into some, really usable range, rather than the A7S III or FX3 sensor of 12,800, where it does feel like it's a little bit too high. And even if you do pump it to 12,800, it seems to be extremely clean. Now, this is with no noise reduction in post-production, but I can barely see any noise. This is very usable. It's pretty wild. This sensor seems to work absolutely fantastic in low light situations. Obviously, there has to be some internal noise reduction at play here because 12,800, 5,000 looks fantastic. Now, you do want to stay with your native ISOs of 640 and 5,000 to get the best dynamic range possible, the best signal to noise ratio possible, but I'm completely blown away by how clean this footage looks. It's really nice. Now, one of my favorite video features happens to be the Cinema 4K, which is 17:9, but it's 96 frames per second and it still has object tracking. If you go a little bit faster to like 120 frames per second, you do lose that object tracking. So that is pretty amazing when it comes to slow motion footage on this with the Cinema 4K. But looking at the Cinema 4K with 120 frames per second, this footage is absolutely crispy. I love the look that comes out of this, the colors that it renders. I am just super impressed with the image quality of this thing. I really do want to compare it to the S1R2 and a couple of other different cameras and sensors to see what the 4K 120 is like in their cameras compared to this, but just completely blown away right now with what this looks like. Now, when it comes to rolling shutter performance, this camera is pretty fast. LUMIX S1II at 5.9K is definitely faster than the LUMIX S1R2 at 8.1K. But obviously there is a catch here when you use the dynamic range boost on, which we did see in the S1R2, that the rolling shutter performance gets significantly worse. So you wouldn't actually use this on moving subjects. This would be more like interviews and just situations where there isn't too much fast-paced motion. And now just comparing the S1II 6K open gate to the S1R2's 6.4K open gate, you can see the rolling shutter performance is much better on the S1II. But now just for a little bit of reference, we put the S1II in 5.9K against the Sony ZV-E1, which is in 4K. You can see the Sony ZV-E1 is 8.7 milliseconds. It's much faster than the 5.9K in the S1II, but still pretty decent performance from the S1II, and you shouldn't really be worried about the rolling shutter performance. But if you do want to talk about rolling shutter performance, watch my S1R2 rolling shutter video. So now when it comes to the autofocus performance, I mean, this camera is pretty much on par with Sony. It is so close, but I mean, Sony might have an edge in some situations. Like, I love putting these cameras into gym situations because there's so many elements in front, and I love shooting through objects and having a lot of depth in the scene. It's very complex, these autofocus situations, and testing it in the real world is extremely important because this is exactly how I work. You can see there are some situations where it does get tripped up, but it still works perfectly fine. Like, it's really difficult situations that even some of my Sony cameras will find it very hard. Like the FX6 doesn't really perform as well as the newer ZV-E1 or the A1 Mark II or the newer Sony cameras, but this is very on point with my FX6 when it comes to that autofocus performance in these types of situations. Like I said, this is a very difficult situation, but the autofocus performance is very reliable. Now, when we talk autofocus, we do have to talk about the new urban sports mode. So this one actually detects athletes with priority in urban sports scenes. So essentially, it tries to figure out, different shapes that people are in. So skateboarding, you can see here, would be quite nice. And it tries to just analyze the human shape and make sure that it keeps it in focus. But this is where you just have to do trial and error and go in between just normal human focus or urban sports. Just go in between and see which one works. But I just used it in normal autofocus and it seems perfectly fine in majority of situations. Now, 70 frames per second is pretty incredible when it comes to sports, wildlife, action photographers. The only thing that you do run into is a little bit of a buffering issue, but it's 70 frames per second, but it will be writing directly to your CF Express Type B cards. They're generally a lot faster than your SD cards and a lot more reliable as well. This is my favorite format in terms of the storage size and the price. This is one of the best cards you can get. But yeah, I was running into a few buffering issues. Didn't seem as bad as the S1II because the S1II is a higher megapixel camera. This is a 24 megapixel camera, so it doesn't seem to be as many buffering issues, but if you do put it into that real high burst rate, you may actually run into that. But you don't need to throw it into that mode all the time. 10 to 15 frames per second should be enough for most people. Me, 10 frames per second is perfectly fine, but at the end of the day, it really depends on what you're actually photographing. Now, interestingly enough, these file sizes are actually quite large. It's 12.5 megabytes right here. This is a JPEG file, and you also get the 1.5 seconds of pre-burst as well. So it's really good for action if you don't want to miss that action. Now, if you are to use the mechanical shutter, this is where you get 10 frames per second, but it is blackout free. Now, one of the great features in this that is new to the LUMIX system, and that is plugging this directly into the USB-C and actually streaming directly from this camera. It is a pretty incredible feature that I've actually been using my Sony a7 IV when it comes to podcast and Zoom calls. I'll literally just plug that directly into my laptop, and then I've got 1080p, really high resolution and good quality Zoom calls, and obviously podcast footage. But you can actually do that now with the LUMIX S1II. Now, I think one problem that came down to the S1II that this doesn't have, that comes down to overheating, and it's been perfectly fine. I was in Texas as well, and this was perfectly fine, but I do believe it's just because it's got that nice fan inbuilt there, but it's a lower resolution sensor. It's 24 megapixels, unlike the higher, S1R2 resolution sensor. That just had a heating problem that hopefully they will fix, in a firmware update to make it, last a little bit longer. But when it comes to overheating, I just don't see there being any issues with this camera. Now, another feature that I do love about the S1II is it does have the shutter close function. So if you are changing out lenses, you can obviously tell the camera to close the shutter when you're exposing that sensor, when you're changing those lenses. So this is a really cool feature to have. And obviously this should be a feature going forward with the newer cameras. So I do feel like LUMIX now are in a really good place in the market because they do have the brand new S1R2, which is the higher resolution photography based camera, but then they've got this S1II, which seems to be that hybrid video style camera. They're really going to be hitting Sony hard. They're going to be hitting Canon hard. There are other manufacturers out there that are really sweating right now. And I think LUMIX are now really making waves in the industry because their autofocus is completely fixed. It's really hard to look past these cameras because of the price. But I want you guys to get active in the comments below what you think of this camera. I really do feel like this is just that perfect, sweet spot when it comes to video and photography. It really is pushing the Z6 III, the Z8, the Sony FX3, the A7S III. It's really pushing those cameras. And in some situations, it's actually surpassing it, which is just absolutely mind-blowing coming from a LUMIX camera. They're really pushing hard. So anyway, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was just a bit of a hands-on first experience with this camera. Like I said, I've got a couple of other videos coming up when I'm comparing this to a couple of other cameras, so make sure you stay tuned for that because I'm so excited to see how far this camera is going to go, how far I can push it, and I'm most likely going to be buying this thing. I think It's pretty incredible. So yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.